Welcome to the show. If you're joining me, it's 23 after 10, Tuesday night it is. It's about time that we brought our guest onto the power seat. His name is Valentino Chingwedere. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Chigwedere Petroleum and Energy Corporation, CPEC. His role, he is responsible for CPEC's regional network of operations, joint ventures, and the sales of fuels, lubricants, trading, importation solutions to various industries. Working with one of the largest independent blenders in sub-Saharan Africa, this man has been in the business for quite a while and is quite reputable when it comes to global traders with some of the most extensive refueling networks in the world. CPE sees imports and re-exports petroleum products to serve more than 5 countries in the SADC region. He also serves as CEO and board member of the African Energy and Economic Youth Council, leading teams across Africa. Youth inclusion in strategic sectors such as mining, oil and gas, and renewable energy is central to his mandate. He is committed to working with and leading young, brilliant minds across the continent to ensure young people are not left behind in this energy transition and in efforts, of course, to eradicate energy problems across the African continent. Let me welcome my brother tonight on the power set. We say Makadini Valentino. Welcome.
Oh, how are you? Makadi, Triple Makadi.
Welcome, my brother.
Thank
So
you so much.
your name has been spoken about in many of the energy circles in Southern Africa, and I'm glad that you're on the show tonight. You describe Africa's dependence on imported refined fuels as a structural vulnerability. How has the Middle East conflict exposed us? And I know that now the Strait of Hormuz is now open.
Yeah, I think, I think just to give context to the viewers and the listeners with regards to what is happening and where we are, just in answering your question, I think, Africa has been dependent on fuel. We've had a lot of major refining hubs or refineries in Africa being closed down, and we've become a net importer of petroleum products. And what then, was very critical or was a big major issue was that when the Strait of Hormuz was closed, we started to see, disruptions in fuel supply, as well as the whole region being affected by the pricing of fuel as well, and that ultimately created a bottleneck for us as Africa. But ultimately, this crisis specifically was not just an artificial crisis. This was actually felt because, if you are a net importer, you are actually directly affected then
Yeah.
when there's no movement of oil being stuck on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz.
Val, Africa with 54 countries, 50 of those countries are net importers of fuel. And as you were saying, there have been quite a number of disruptions, the recent one being the war in Iran. So if this kind of thing persists, what kind of energy crisis do you think Africa will get to experience?
Yeah, so I think the first one ultimately that was immediately felt at the pumps for the daily person was, the fuel prices, right? But what becomes a big issue also is, the inflation risks that exist because we're importing that inflation because we are buying firstly in foreign currency, which is in the USD, and then any inflation that comes from there, then we are then affected, right? And this cascades ultimately to higher fuel costs, increases in transport, food manufacturing prices, and generally, the rising living costs for the general African person here in Africa. And I think that's one of the things that are there. So, and you also look at from a governmental perspective, and economically as well. We are also facing that currency pressures that we are also getting. So those are the majority of the things. But I think one of the biggest macro, um, you know, how can I say it, instability or stability that we faced also is just the risk of energy security. Economies need to move, and if you cannot source, or reliably security of supply of fuel, then you are ultimately affected by, just in ensuring that the economy moves into what it needs to be.
Valentino, people have said that Africa should be the one exporting fuel rather than importing fuel. Angola's got fuel, Nigeria's got fuel. Some places have had fuel being discovered. They haven't started the exploitation of fuel yet, and those include Zimbabwe, DRC. What do you think the best way out of the crisis that we're facing in Africa is?
Yeah, so I think the best way that we can take from is ultimately investing in our natural resources, right? Ultimately, this speaks to the fuel that or the oil reserves that we have locally, but also we need to be incentivized by the government as well, right? You spoke of countries like Angola, right, who have an abundance of oil resources. And what is happening in Angola is that they've also, I think about 70% of their fuel needs are actually imported. And what we've then seen is, now with some of the refineries coming online, it just becomes a great vertical integration between, the upstream of actually oil exploration and taking out the barrel from the ground and pumping it, and then having a refinery that you don't necessarily have to export, right? But then having it refined locally so that you don't absorb any pricing, inflationary pricing or freight costs. But second to that, you look at how we can replicate models that already exist, like the Dangote refinery, that has become a huge regional game changer. And what that means ultimately is that currently now Nigeria has become, or the Dangote refinery, and as Nigeria has become the biggest jet fuel exporter, within the mega refinery perspective. So I think it is a matter of us being able to ensure that we are able to invest in the necessary resources, but also not have fragmented smaller refineries, but look at scaling those refineries to build that demand and to ensure that we compete competitively. But also an incentive from the government would also be very, very imperative, because these are large scale projects that do require government intervention as well to ensure that it's a conducive environment for investors.
I'm very concerned African governments don't seem to be moving at the speed in which they should be moving. Dangote, is an aggressive international businessman. Yes, has done extensively well by beginning to export fuel out of Nigeria. How come no other African company or business conglomerates within the energy sector are beginning to do what Dangote has done in places like you're saying Angola, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Niger? Why can't we get them to do what Dangote has done?
Look, I think it all depends on investor confidence, right? Like I said, you look at the Dangote refinery, which a lot of people even doubted would have came into existence. I mean, the years it has taken for it to come here. And you look at, he had to personally invest, a significant chunk of his own personal net worth and financing in there. So it boils down to, economics, the macro and the micro environment, as well as the government policy within that. So if government, just from a licensing perspective, doesn't create that certainty that if an investor comes and invests about 20 billion, just for example, like the Dangote refinery, um, to recoup that type of investment back, it's not a 10-year investment horizon. It's a legacy structure, and I think you look at how policies, even in South Africa, is shaped. a lot of the big oil international majors from divesting away from the refineries here in South Africa. You look at SAPREF, in South Africa, we've got what we call the Clean Fuels 2 policy that was implemented by the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. And the effect of that, policy was that it encouraged or incentivized that all fuel standards need to meet European 5 standards, right? Meaning that these refineries could not even meet those standards, and they were not incentivized ultimately to then invest in upgrading those facilities. With the only exceptional note of the Astron Energy, which is currently still upgrading but is already operational. So it's those fundamentals that investors look at to say, can we invest in a market that we know that politically we are supported, from a policy perspective we are competitive, but thirdly as well, we're able to take out our money to get our ROI, but also ensure that we have the right backing, and the demand is there within that specific country. And those are sort of like the main ones. But one of the biggest one that is also overlooked is the issue of access to port infrastructure, as well as railway lines. Railway lines and pipelines that are used then to move that product once you've invested in refining capacity in whatever country that you're investing in.
Yes, energy is the thing that drives, industrialization. And as you're talking, Val, I also want to bring in international players like China, the UK, UAE. Are they beginning to start to increase their investment in African refining? Are they moving fast enough, and are they sincere?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to who's moving fast enough, I think you look at the Chinese have been fast, but the front runner I would say right now is the UAE. I'm sure today you might have seen the announcement of the final signing, pending obviously regulatory approvals for the Shell downstream South Africa, for the Shell assets in South Africa by the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, which is a UAE national oil company. So there is a huge appetite, but the appetite right now isn't coming from international oil companies. Funny enough, the appetite is coming from international traders, right? You look at Africa, one of the biggest they'll term themselves as Pan African oil company, which is British linked to Vitol, which is one of the biggest oil traders. They own Vivo Energy, and Vivo Energy has huge market share within the within the oil and gas industry from a downstream perspective. So they own retail sites that are owned by Shell and Engine across Africa. And in South Africa, they recently just bought Engine. And now you see UAE through ADNOC has bought Shell. So the appetite is there, but it's not coming from your Totals, your European
Yeah.
majors or international oil companies. It's coming from the traders themselves and national oil companies from the Gulf.
That's quite interesting. One of the things we really need to sort out as Africa is the energy. Once we do that, we will definitely leapfrog forward. Let's talk about one of the organizations that you represent. You also lead the African Energy and Economic Youth Council. Why is youth inclusion critical in areas like energy, like mining, like gas, like renewable energies solutions in Africa?
Yeah, I think if we're tied down to where we are right now, the focus in Africa is, industrialization, and we want to take Africa, from an Agenda 2063 perspective, right? And I think to build the Africa that we want, um, the people who are going to be the beneficiaries and ensure that that vision of Agenda 2063 is successful will then come from the young people. And it comes down to then, for me, how do you ensure that young people in Africa in particular are not left within the second wave of industrialization that is actually happening in Africa through infrastructure, through energy, mining, oil and gas, not just as employees, but as strategic owners, engineers, and financiers within that. And I think for us, this is the pivotal moment that we build, the African engineering, technical, entrepreneurial capacity from an African energy or in any strategic sector within Africa, and ensure that the next generation of Africa actually drives Africa's industrial future. So I think that for me is one of the most important things for youth inclusion, in particular in mining, oil and gas, as well as renewables.
Now, Valentino, as we wrap up the conversation, quite importantly, what do you think the future of the energy sector looks like, both in Southern Africa and in North Africa? And it looks like North Africa is moving much quicker than Southern Africa. Why is that? What do you see us in 3 years?
No, to be quite honest with you, energy is a broad topic, right? But if we're to bring it into where we are right now, in terms of investment horizons and what's happening in the continent, I think in Africa and in Southern Africa, security of supply is going to be a pivotal conversation, where we're seeing a lot of storage terminals being built. We're seeing, interest from a SADC region, in particular, port infrastructure being very important, pipeline infrastructure, particularly for energy as well. But I think the conversation, if you look at it from a Northern Africa, I think you see they have a huge industrial base of refining capacity, and for them, their priorities would then be easier to focus either on gas investments or on renewable energy. But within a SADC focus or Southern African focus, ours is to ensure that we've got security of supply from a liquid fuels perspective. And I think that's one of the most imperative things that we are going to see within the next 3 years. One, from a policy perspective, and two, just from an investment perspective. Like I mentioned earlier, from either the Gulf and East Asia or the Far East, but those are going to be one of the pivotal things. But if we're able to then, come together as a collective and say, it's not about whether it's oil and gas or renewables, it's all about how do we ensure that Africa is energy secure, and has the right, security of supply to ensure that it drives the necessary industrialization that it requires for Africa to then compete competitively outside of just being a producer or a supplier of raw materials.
Hey, Valentino, thank you so much for having joined us. That is the CEO of the Chigwedere Petroleum and Energy Corporation. He has been our very special guest tonight on the Power Seat. I wish you only the best.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is Channel Africa.
The Upside with Poppy Jongwana and Nsako Mhlanga.